The morning sun was barely peeking through the blinds of Rick's apartment as he scrambled to get ready for work. He was already running late for his shift at the local hardware store, a job he had held for nearly 5 years. At 32, Rick wasn't where he had imagined he would be in life, but he took pride in his work and the knowledge he had gained about home improvement. His customers appreciated his honest advice and patience when explaining complicated projects. As he locked his apartment door, Rick noticed a piece of paper taped to it. Curious, he pulled it off and quickly scanned the contents. It was a notice from the building management company about a tenant meeting scheduled for that evening. Something about new parking regulations. Rick stuffed the paper into his pocket, making a mental note to attend if he got off work in time. The hardware store was unusually busy that day. A pipe had burst in the neighborhood elementary school, and contractors were rushing in to purchase supplies. By the time Rick's shift ended at 6 p.m., he was exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. He had helped several desperate homeowners with emergency repairs and even stayed an extra half hour to walk an elderly customer through a simple plumbing fix. When Rick finally arrived back at his apartment complex, the parking lot was fuller than usual. He circled twice before finding a spot at the far end, near the dumpsters. It wasn't his assigned space, but it wasn't marked as reserved either. He figured it would be fine just for one night. Tomorrow he would move his car back to its regular spot. After a quick shower and a microwaved dinner, Rick collapsed on his couch. He had completely forgotten about the tenant meeting until his phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor reminding him. Glancing at his watch, he saw it was already 7:30 p.m. The meeting had started half an hour ago. Too late now, Rick muttered to himself as he flipped through channels on TV. He would catch up with his neighbor later to find out what he had missed. The following morning, Rick woke up earlier than usual. He had a strange feeling of unease that he couldn't quite place. As he went through his morning routine, the feeling persisted. It wasn't until he opened his front door to leave for work that he understood why. His car was gone. Rick stood frozen in the doorway, blinking several times as if his car might magically reappear. It didn't. He rushed down to the parking lot, searching frantically. Had he parked it somewhere else and forgotten? No, he distinctly remembered parking near the dumpsters last night. As he stood bewildered in the spot where his car should have been, a woman approached him. She was in her mid-40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses perched on her head despite the early hour. She wore an expression that somehow combined smugness with outrage. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Rick turned to her, confused. "My car. It was right here last night." "Oh, that old Honda?" "It's been towed," she said, her tone changing to one of satisfaction. "That's my guest parking spot. It's clearly marked in the tenant agreement." Rick's confusion turned to irritation. "There's no sign here. How was I supposed to know?" The woman, who introduced herself as Diane Peterson, the head of the tenant association, rolled her eyes dramatically. "It was all explained at the meeting last night. The one you couldn't bother to attend. We've implemented new parking regulations. Each resident has their assigned spot, and the visitor spots are assigned to board members for their guests." Rick took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I've lived here for 3 years. That rule has never existed before." "Well, it exists now," Diane said sharply. "And as head of the tenant association, I have the authority to enforce it. Your car has been towed to Miller's Towing on Highway 28. The fee is $250 plus $75 for each day it remains there." Rick's face paled. That was almost half his weekly paycheck. "This isn't right. You can't just make up rules and tow people's cars without proper notice." Diane's smile was cold. "Actually, I can. It's all in the bylaws. Perhaps if you had attended the meeting, you would understand how things work around here now." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Rick standing alone in the empty parking spot. He pulled out his phone to call his manager. He was going to be late for work again, and this time, he had a major problem to solve. As Rick waited for a rideshare to take him to the towing company, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation wasn't right. The towing fee would put a significant dent in his savings, but what bothered him more was the smug satisfaction on Diane's face. It seemed like she had enjoyed having his car towed. At the towing company, things got even worse. The attendant informed Rick that in addition to the towing fee, there was also a processing fee and an after-hours retrieval surcharge, since his car had been brought in after 9 p.m. The total came to $375. "This is highway robbery," Rick protested, but the attendant merely shrugged. "Take it up with your HOA, buddy. We just do what we're told." After emptying most of his checking account to get his car back, Rick drove straight to work, his mind racing with thoughts about what had just happened. During his lunch break, he called his cousin Lee, who happened to be a paralegal at a law firm specializing in housing disputes. "Something doesn't sound right about this," Lee said after Rick explained the situation. "They can't just change rules overnight and enforce them without proper notification." "That's what I thought," Rick replied, "but Diane seems to think she has all the power in the world." Lee's voice took on a determined tone. "Send me any documentation you have about your tenant agreement and these supposed new regulations. I'll have one of our attorneys take a look. This Diane person might think she has power, but there are laws that protect tenants from exactly this kind of arbitrary enforcement." For the first time since discovering his car missing, Rick felt a glimmer of hope. If what Diane had done was illegal, perhaps he could not only get his money back but also prevent her from doing the same thing to other residents in the future. What Rick didn't know was that Diane Peterson had built quite a reputation in the complex over the past year. Since becoming head of the tenant association, she had implemented numerous rules that seemed designed more to assert her authority than to improve the community. Several residents had complained, but most were too intimidated by her connections with the property management company to take action. Little did Diane know that her towing of Rick's car would be the beginning of a chain of events that would challenge her perceived power and teach her a valuable lesson about the actual limits of her authority, and the real consequences of overstepping those bounds. The next few days were tense at the apartment complex. Rick kept his head down and made sure to park exactly in his assigned spot, but he couldn't help noticing Diane watching him from her balcony whenever he came home from work. She seemed to be waiting for him to make another mistake. Meanwhile, Rick's cousin Lee had been busy. On Thursday evening, Rick's phone rang just as he was finishing dinner. "I showed your lease agreement to Tom, one of our housing attorneys," Lee said without preamble. "He says you've got a solid case against both the tenant association and the property management company." Rick sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" "For starters, any rule changes require written notice at least 30 days in advance according to your lease. Plus, the tenant association doesn't actually have the authority to order towing without the management company's explicit approval for each instance." A weight lifted from Rick's shoulders. So what Diane did was illegal? Completely. Tom says she overstepped her bounds in about 5 different ways. And here's the kicker, you're not the first person she's done this to. I checked public records and found 3 small claims cases filed against your complex in the past 6 months, all involving improper towing. Rick wasn't surprised. He had seen the way Diane strutted around the complex, clipboard in hand, looking for violations to report. So what should I do? Tom's willing to write a formal letter demanding reimbursement for the towing fees plus compensation for your missed work hours. If they refuse, we can escalate to small claims court. After hanging up, Rick felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He was glad to know he had the law on his side, but confronting Diane would surely make living in the complex uncomfortable. The following Monday, Rick arrived home to find a yellow envelope taped to his door. Inside was a formal letter from the property management company, stating that he had violated community rules by storing personal items on his balcony. According to the letter, he had 48 hours to remove the items or face a $100 fine. Rick stepped onto his balcony, bewildered. The only things there were a small potted plant and a folding chair, items that had been there since he moved in. Through the railing, he could see Diane on her balcony, watching him with a smirk. This was clearly retaliation. Rick took photos of his balcony and the neighboring ones, many of which had far more items displayed. Then he called Lee. "She's harassing you," Lee said firmly after hearing about the notice. "This strengthens our case. Tom can add harassment to the letter." 2 days later, Rick received the legal letter from Tom's firm. It was addressed to both the property management company and Diane personally, detailing the illegal towing, the harassment, and the improper rule changes. The letter demanded full reimbursement of the towing fees, $200 compensation for lost wages, and an immediate cessation of all harassment. It gave them 7 days to respond before legal action would be taken. Rick made copies of the letter, keeping one in his car and one at home. He wasn't sure how Diane would react, but he wanted to be prepared. He didn't have to wait long to find out. That evening, as Rick was returning from the grocery store, Diane intercepted him in the parking lot. Her face was flushed with anger, and she waved a copy of the letter in her hand. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Are you threatening me with a lawsuit?" Rick remained calm. "I'm just asking for what's fair. You had my car towed illegally, and now you're targeting me with fake violations. I am the head of the tenant association." Diane's voice rose even higher. "I decide what's allowed in this complex." Several neighbors had stepped onto their balconies to watch the confrontation. Rick noticed phones being held up, people were recording this. "Actually, you don't," Rick said quietly. "The rules are set by the management company, with proper notice to all tenants. What you did was illegal, and you know it." Diane's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "We'll see about that. I know the property manager personally. One word from me, and your lease won't be renewed." A man stepped forward from the small crowd that had gathered. Rick recognized him as Pat from Unit 14B. "She did the same thing to me last month," Pat said. "Claimed I violated some rule about bicycle storage and had my bike impounded. Cost me $150 to get it back." Another resident joined in. "She fined me for having unapproved curtains, whatever that means." Suddenly, it seemed everyone had a story about Diane's arbitrary rule enforcement. As more neighbors shared their experiences, Diane's indignant expression began to falter. Without another word, she turned and stormed off toward the management office. Rick exchanged phone numbers with Pat and a few other residents who had been victims of Diane's power trips. What had started as a personal fight for justice was quickly becoming something bigger, a community standing up against someone who had been abusing her position for far too long. The following day, the property management office was busier than it had ever been. Residents lined up outside, each holding copies of violation notices they had received from Diane over the past year. What had begun as Rick's individual stand against injustice had sparked a full-blown tenant rebellion. Inside the office, the property manager, Mr. Jenkins, was overwhelmed. He hadn't realized the extent of Diane's overreach until now. When Rick entered with Pat and 3 other residents, Mr. Jenkins looked like he hadn't slept. "I've received the letter from your attorney," Mr. Jenkins said, gesturing for Rick to sit down. "And I've spent the morning reviewing our records. It appears there have been irregularities in how the tenant association has been operating." Rick nodded but remained silent. He had learned from Lee that it was better to let the other party do the talking in situations like this. Ms. Peterson was given limited authority to report violations, but she was never authorized to implement new rules or order towing without approval. Mr. Jenkins continued, rubbing his temples. "The company will, of course, reimburse your towing fees and the requested compensation for lost wages." Pat leaned forward. "What about the rest of us? I had to pay to get my bike back." Mr. Jenkins sighed. "We'll need to review each case individually, but yes, if there were improper fees or fines, those will be addressed." Just then, the office door burst open, and Diane stormed in. When she saw Rick and the others, she froze momentarily before regaining her composure. "What's going on here?" she demanded. "Are you holding some kind of meeting without the tenant association present?" Mr. Jenkins stood up. "Ms. Peterson, we need to discuss your role in the tenant association. There have been numerous complaints about your conduct." Diane's face flushed. "Complaints? I've been enforcing the rules. Someone has to maintain standards around here." "Rules that you made up," Rick said quietly. "Without proper notice or authority. That's ridiculous. I was given full authority by the management company." Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Actually, Ms. Peterson, that's not accurate. Your position as head of the tenant association was meant to be a liaison between residents and management, not an enforcement role." The color drained from Diane's face as she realized her position was crumbling. "But you told me." "I told you to report violations of existing rules, not create new ones," Mr. Jenkins said firmly. "And certainly not to harass residents or order towings without consultation." Outside the office, more residents had gathered, many holding their phones. Through the glass doors, Rick could see them recording the confrontation. By evening, the videos would be shared throughout the complex's community chat group. Diane noticed the crowd too, and for the first time, she seemed to understand that her perceived power had been just that, a perception, not reality. Her authority had been built on intimidation rather than actual legal standing. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. She turned and pushed her way through the crowd, ignoring the comments and questions thrown her way. As Rick watched her leave, he felt no satisfaction in her humiliation. His goal had never been to embarrass Diane but simply to stand up for what was right and fair. The legal lesson was being delivered, but it was clear this story was far from over. The next few days brought dramatic changes to the apartment complex. Management sent out a formal notice to all residents explaining that the tenant association was being temporarily disbanded and restructured. The notice included a sincere apology for any improper enforcement actions that had occurred and invited affected residents to submit claims for reimbursement. Rick received his check for the towing fees plus compensation for lost wages within 48 hours. The efficiency surprised him. It seemed the management company was eager to resolve the situation before it escalated further. "They're worried about a class action lawsuit," Lee explained when Rick called to update her. "Tom says at least 15 residents have contacted our firm already." "I never wanted this to become such a big deal," Rick admitted. "I just wanted my money back and for the harassment to stop." "Sometimes it takes one person standing up to reveal a bigger problem," Lee replied. "You should be proud. You've helped a lot of people." Meanwhile, Diane had made herself scarce. Her usual spot on the balcony remained empty, and her car hadn't been in the parking lot for days. Rumors circulated that she had gone to stay with her sister in the next town over, too embarrassed to face her neighbors. But on Friday afternoon, as Rick returned from work, he found Diane waiting by his parking space. Her usual polished appearance had slipped, her hair was less perfect, her clothes more casual. She looked tired. Rick braced himself for another confrontation as he got out of his car. "Can we talk?" Diane asked, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. Rick nodded cautiously. "Sure." "Not here," she said, glancing around at the curious faces watching from windows and balconies. "Could we go to the picnic area? It's more private." They walked in uncomfortable silence to the small picnic area behind the complex. Once they were seated at a table, Diane took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. "I overstepped my authority with you and with others." Rick was taken aback. This wasn't what he had expected. "The management company has asked me to resign from the tenant association," she continued. "And rightfully so. I got carried away with the position." "Why?" Rick couldn't help asking. "Why were you so aggressive about enforcing rules that didn't even exist?" Diane looked down at her hands. "Before I moved here, I lived in a complex that fell apart because nobody cared about maintaining standards. Property values plummeted. I lost a lot of money when I had to sell. When I was appointed to the association here, I was determined not to let that happen again." Her explanation didn't justify her actions, but it helped Rick understand her perspective a little better. "That doesn't make what I did right," Diane added quickly. "I went too far. Way too far. I've been meeting with some of the other residents I harmed. You were next on my list." Rick nodded, processing her words. "I appreciate the apology." "There's something else," Diane said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out an envelope. "This is a personal check from me, covering the amount you were reimbursed. The management company shouldn't have to pay for my mistakes." Rick stared at the envelope, unsure how to respond. This was an unexpected turn of events, and he wondered if this change of heart was genuine or simply damage control. Rick looked at the envelope for a long moment before gently pushing it back across the table. "I appreciate the gesture," he said carefully, "but this isn't just about the money. It's about recognizing boundaries and respecting other people's rights." Diane's face fell slightly. "I understand. I really am trying to make things right." "Then do that by changing how you interact with your neighbors going forward," Rick suggested. "The money has already been paid back by the company. They're the ones who gave you authority you shouldn't have had in the first place." A thoughtful expression crossed Diane's face. She hadn't considered it that way before. "You're right," she admitted. "The company should have provided better oversight." Just then, Rick's phone buzzed. It was a message from Lee, "Meeting at the community center tomorrow at 7. Management company representatives will be there. Bring neighbors." He showed the message to Diane. "Looks like things are moving quickly." Diane nodded. "Will you be going?" "Yes. I think it's important that residents have a say in how the complex is managed going forward." "Do you think?" Diane hesitated, then continued, "Do you think I should attend too?" Rick considered this. Despite everything, Diane clearly cared about the community, even if her methods had been all wrong. If you're willing to listen more than talk, it might be good for everyone. The meeting the next evening was packed. Nearly every unit in the complex was represented, and representatives from the property management company sat at a table at the front of the room. Mr. Jenkins looked nervous as he called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss restructuring the tenant association and clarifying the rules and procedures for our community," he began. From the back, a resident called out, "How do we know this won't happen again? Someone else getting drunk on power?" Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat. "We're implementing new checks and balances. Any rule changes will require a vote by all residents, with 30 days' notice. The tenant association will be elected democratically, not appointed. And most importantly, no individual will have authority to issue fines or authorize towing." Rick, sitting near the front, noticed Diane slip into the room. She took a seat in the corner, trying to be inconspicuous. Several residents noticed her and whispered to each other, but no one confronted her. As the meeting progressed, various residents stood up to share ideas for improving the community. Pat suggested creating a shared online calendar for the laundry room to reduce conflicts. An elderly resident proposed a buddy system for helping with grocery deliveries. Another resident volunteered to organize a monthly community cleanup day. The atmosphere gradually shifted from anger and suspicion to constructive collaboration. Rick found himself impressed by his neighbors' genuine care for their shared living space. Near the end of the meeting, Mr. Jenkins asked if anyone else wanted to speak. To everyone's surprise, Diane raised her hand and slowly stood up. The room fell silent as she walked to the front. Many people crossed their arms, expressions guarded. "I know many of you are angry with me," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "You have every right to be. I abused the limited authority I was given and made living here stressful for many of you." She paused, looking around the room. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or another chance at leadership. But I do have skills that might be useful to our community in other ways." Rick watched, curious about where this was going. Was this another power play, or was Diane genuinely trying to find a new way to contribute? "Before I moved here," Diane continued, "I worked as an event coordinator. I'm good at organizing, scheduling, and bringing people together, when I'm not letting my control issues get in the way." This last part she added with a self-deprecating smile that seemed genuine. The community garden that was proposed last year never got off the ground because no one had time to coordinate it. "I'd be willing to help organize that project, under supervision if necessary." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people still looked skeptical, but others seemed willing to consider her offer. An older woman stood up. "I've wanted that garden for years. If you're serious about helping, I'd be willing to work with you." "Me too," added another resident. "My kids would love to learn about growing vegetables." Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat. "We could allocate some of the landscaping budget to starting materials for the garden." Rick watched this exchange with interest. He believed in second chances, but he also knew that action spoke louder than words. Diane would need to prove herself through consistent behavior, not just a single speech. After the meeting concluded, people lingered in small groups, discussing the proposed changes. Rick found himself in conversation with Pat and several other neighbors he'd never spoken with before. There was a new sense of community in the air, ironically brought about by Diane's overreach and the collective response to it. As Rick was about to leave, Diane approached him. "Thank you," she said simply. Rick tilted his head. "For what?" "For standing up to me. For refusing to let me bully you. I needed that wake-up call, even if I didn't want it at the time." Her words seemed sincere, but Rick remained cautious. "Just remember that organizing a garden doesn't mean controlling it. The whole point is that it belongs to everyone." Diane nodded. "I'm learning. It won't happen overnight, but I'm trying." In the weeks that followed, true to her word, Diane focused her energy on the community garden project. She created sign-up sheets, researched plants that would grow well in their climate, and coordinated with the landscaping company to prepare the soil. But importantly, she consulted the other interested residents at every step and deferred to their preferences when opinions differed. Rick kept his distance initially, watching from afar as the garden took shape in a previously unused corner of the property. But one Saturday, as he walked past the garden area, he saw Diane and several other residents on their knees in the dirt, working together to plant seedlings. On impulse, he approached them. "Need another pair of hands?" The smile that lit up Diane's face wasn't the smug one he remembered from their first confrontation. It was open and genuine. "Always," she replied, handing him a trowel. "We're trying to finish the herbs section today." As Rick joined the group, he reflected on how differently things had turned out than he expected. When he'd first received that legal letter from Tom, he'd imagined a courtroom showdown, not a community garden. The legal lesson had been delivered, but there had been unexpected learning on all sides. Mr. Jenkins approached the garden area, clipboard in hand. Unlike Diane's previous clipboard-wielding days, this one contained a list of approved supplies the company was providing for the garden project. "I've got good news," Mr. Jenkins announced to the gardening group. The company has approved additional funding for the garden project based on the positive response from residents. We can expand into the east section as well. Excited chatter broke out among the volunteers. The garden had already become a source of pride for the complex, with several residents who had never participated in community activities before now showing up regularly to help. "That's fantastic," Diane said, then looked around at the group. "What does everyone think we should do with the additional space? Flowers? More vegetables?" Rick noticed how naturally she deferred to the group now, a sharp contrast to her previous behavior. The change seemed genuine. Later, as the gardening session wound down, Rick's phone rang. It was Lee. "How are things going with the tenant association situation?" she asked. Rick glanced around at the garden and the people chatting happily as they cleaned their tools. "Better than expected, actually. The new democratic structure is working well, and Diane has found a better way to channel her energy." "That's good to hear," Lee replied. "Actually, the reason I'm calling is that Tom wanted me to tell you something interesting. Remember those other cases we found against the complex for improper towing?" "Yeah, what about them?" "Turns out they were all dismissed because the residents couldn't prove they hadn't violated any rules. Your case was different because you had documentation and legal support. You created a precedent that's already helping others." Rick hadn't thought about the wider implications of his stand against Diane. "How so?" "Tom's gotten calls from 3 other complexes in the area with similar issues. Your case is being cited as an example of tenant rights. The management companies are suddenly much more careful about enforcement procedures." After hanging up, Rick shared this news with Pat, who had become a good friend through their shared experience. "You're like a local legal hero," Pat joked, but there was truth behind the humor. Word spread quickly through the complex. At the next community meeting, several residents approached Rick to thank him for taking a stand that had benefited more people than just those in their building. The newly elected tenant association, which now included Rick as a member, despite his initial reluctance, had established clear, fair guidelines for community living. Unlike Diane's arbitrary rules, these had been voted on by all residents and were documented in an updated handbook that everyone received. Diane hadn't sought a position on the new association, recognizing that it might be too soon for people to trust her in that role. Instead, she continued to focus on the garden project, which was flourishing under the collaborative approach. One evening, as Rick was returning from work, he noticed a tow truck in the parking lot. For a moment, his heart sank, thinking the old problems were returning. But as he got closer, he saw that the truck was actually delivering a car, not taking one away. The driver was helping an elderly resident whose car had broken down earlier that day. Standing beside them, coordinating the delivery, was Diane. The association approved emergency assistance for Mrs. Wu, she explained when she saw Rick's questioning look. Her car broke down at the grocery store, and she needed help getting it back here where her regular mechanic can fix it tomorrow. The contrast with Diane's previous use of tow trucks wasn't lost on Rick. What had once been a tool of her misused power was now being employed to help a neighbor in need. 3 months had passed since the confrontation that had changed the apartment complex. The community garden was now in full bloom, with residents regularly harvesting vegetables and herbs for their meals. What had started as a small project had expanded to include a children's section where kids from the complex learned about growing food, a meditation corner with fragrant flowers, and even a small pond with water lilies. One Saturday morning, Rick arrived at the garden for his regular volunteer shift to find an unexpected scene. A local news van was parked nearby, and a reporter was interviewing several residents. "What's going on?" Rick asked Pat, who was watering tomato plants. The community garden caught the attention of the city's Neighborhood Heroes segment, Pat explained. "They're doing a piece on how our complex transformed from having one of the highest complaint rates in the district to becoming a model community. The reporter spotted Rick and approached him with a microphone. "I understand you were instrumental in starting the changes here. Would you mind sharing your perspective?" Rick felt uncomfortable being singled out. "It wasn't just me. Everyone here contributed to making this a better place to live. But it started with you standing up legally," the reporter pressed. "That took courage." Before Rick could respond, Diane stepped forward. "If you want to know the real story," she said to the reporter, "it's about accountability and redemption. Rick taught me an important legal lesson about the limits of authority, and I needed to learn it." The reporter looked intrigued by this unexpected twist. "You're the former tenant association head?" Diane nodded. "I am. And I misused what little power I had. The story worth telling isn't just about standing up to authority, it's about what happens afterward. How communities can heal and grow stronger." Rick was surprised by Diane's candor. She could have avoided the interview entirely or tried to downplay her past actions. Instead, she was publicly acknowledging her mistakes. The resulting news segment aired the following week, and to Rick's relief, it focused not on villainizing Diane but on the positive transformation of the community. The reporter highlighted how the complex had created a more democratic governance structure and turned unused space into a thriving garden. The publicity had an unexpected effect. Other apartment complexes in the area began reaching out to learn from their experience. Mr. Jenkins, seeing an opportunity for positive PR, encouraged these exchanges and even organized an open house where other property managers could tour the garden and learn about their new governance model. During one such tour, Rick overheard Diane explaining to a visitor, "The key was realizing that true power isn't about control, it's about enabling others. When I was focused on enforcing rules, I thought I was building a better community. But it wasn't until I started helping people work together that anything actually improved." Later that day, as Rick was leaving, Diane approached him. "I've been offered a position," she said. "What kind of position?" Rick asked, curious. "Community Relations Coordinator for the management company. They want me to help implement similar programs at their other properties." Rick raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Are you going to take it?" Diane looked thoughtful. "I wanted to ask your opinion first. Given our history, do you think I should?" Rick considered Diane's question carefully. It was a significant moment. Her asking his opinion showed how much things had changed between them. "Do you want the job?" he asked, turning the question back to her. "I think I could do some good," she replied. "Use what I've learned here to help other communities. But I'm concerned that people will only see me as I was before." Rick nodded, understanding her worry. 6 months ago, I would have said no. I wouldn't have trusted you with that kind of position." Diane's face fell slightly, but she nodded in acceptance. "But," Rick continued, "I've watched you change. Not just your behavior, but your understanding of what community really means. If you approach this new role with the same humility and collaborative spirit you've shown with the garden, I think you should take it." Relief washed over Diane's face. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." The following weekend, the complex held a community barbecue to celebrate the garden's success. Residents of all ages gathered around tables set up between the flower beds and vegetable patches. Children played tag through the grass paths while adults chatted and shared food from diverse cultural backgrounds. Mr. Jenkins made a short speech announcing Diane's new role and thanking everyone who had contributed to the community's transformation. There was genuine applause when Diane stood up, a far cry from the tension that had filled the air at meetings just months before. As the celebration continued, Rick found himself sitting with his cousin Lee, who had come to see the garden she'd heard so much about. "I have to admit," Lee said, "when you first called me about that towing incident, I never imagined it would lead to all this. I thought it would be a simple legal matter, get your money back, make them stop harassing you, end of story." Rick smiled. "Life has a way of surprising you. Sometimes what starts as standing up for yourself turns into something bigger. Lee raised her glass in a toast. To standing up for what's right. And to second chances, Rick added, glancing across the garden where Diane was showing a group of children how to harvest carrots without damaging the plants. A week later, Rick received an envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a formal letter from the property management company announcing a rent freeze for all current residents for the next year, citing exceptional community engagement as the reason. Along with it was a handwritten note from Diane. My first official act in the new position. Not all power is bad when it's used to lift people up instead of push them down. Thank you for the legal lesson that changed everything. Diane. Rick pinned the letter to his refrigerator, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected confrontations lead to the most meaningful changes. As he headed to work that morning, Rick noticed new residents moving into a recently vacated apartment. They looked overwhelmed with boxes and furniture. Need a hand? He offered, setting down his lunch bag. The surprised but grateful smile he received reminded him of how far their community had come. What had begun as an individual stand against injustice had transformed into a neighborhood where people looked out for one another. The legal lesson had been learned, and its effects would continue to ripple outward for years to come.